Henry and Mabel, and also Lynn Huidang, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Much of what I would like to talk about focuses very much on interconnectedness and the very granular and new way we've had to look at interconnectedness in the period since COVID began to impact on us. For some, this has resulted in a turning inwards, focus more on domestic supply, and certainly with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the impacts have been profound when it comes to commodity prices, food and energy security. Now we're looking at inflation. All of these major headwinds have got so much stronger. But for some, as I say, that's resulted in turning inwards. For most of us, there certainly is a growing awareness of logistical realities, the factors around geography, the bottlenecks in supply chains. As others have said, you know, there's a greater turn from a focus on efficiency in supply chains to now a much greater focus on resilience. You know, we've talked about just-in-time supply. I think now we're dealing with just-in-case supply approaches around logistics. Words like redundancy in supply chains or duplication used to be bad things. Now we're seeing them as something that needs to be a factor within supply chains. So for all of us, I think there's been a changing approach on these issues. But even so, we've learned these lessons in New Zealand, and we have looked and are continuing to work on supply chains, particularly given that we're at the far end of a very long, skinny supply chain from the rest of the world to New Zealand. Even so, though, our primary response has actually been to instead double down in our efforts to keep trade flowing, to keep markets open. And perhaps that's not surprising, not a surprising result to come from a smaller trade-dependent country. But we also can make a strong argument that doubling down in this way actually is a rational policy, not just for smaller countries, but for larger countries as well. The agenda that we've adopted, whether it be bilateral or regional, focused on free trade agreements and other creative approaches to economic integration, has been hyperactive rather than reduced. We've concluded new FTAs, for example, with the United Kingdom. We've also upgraded our free trade agreement with China. We're working on hopefully concluding an agreement with the EU. We're engaging with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We're working with other countries on a climate change and trade agreement, which was concluded, and now we're inviting others to join. And similarly, we're very active in looking at the applications for membership of CPTPP and also the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement expressed by other countries wishing to join these agreements. So we have a very active agenda around seeking to keep economic engagement flowing effectively, fairly and freely at the same time. In addition to these bilateral, plurilateral efforts, for us the priority must remain an effective multilateral trading system in the WTO. And like others, you know, we're heartened by the fact that MC12 met and achieved some significant outcomes last week. That's to be welcomed. We're particularly pleased to see the fish subsidies agreement concluded. Yes, there's still work to be done on some aspects, but we have the framework agreement agreed. This has been something we've been active on as a WTO member for more than 1 decade. Actually, my colleagues tell me we've been active on it for 2 decades. So we're particularly pleased to see it concluded. And of course, the TRIPS waiver the declaration on response to COVID, extended e-commerce moratorium, but there are a lot of areas that, just to state the obvious, no forward movement was really achieved at the meeting. We've looked particularly at the agricultural trade reform area requiring attention, and if we're going to advance food security and food availability, then agricultural trade reform, particularly around domestic subsidies, will continue to be an extremely important area to work on. Beyond that, of course, it's the gorilla that does still get mentioned, but it's the gorilla of, the fact that we do not have a functioning appellate body at the WTO at the moment, which is impacting more generally on the dispute settlement process. Yes, there are collective efforts to ensure that at the panel stage it can continue to function. And yes, there is an arrangement amongst a number of WTO members in terms of putting in place an ad hoc appellate mechanism. But we need to work on those tough issues around making sure that the dispute settlement body can function again, and also some of those underlying issues that are particularly difficult to deal with around inclusion and effectiveness of functioning of the existing body. Now, I've spoken for too long. I'll just make one final comment. Implementation of norms is absolutely crucial. And again, we can make the case why it's important both for big countries and small countries to have norms around multilateral trading system, and of course, national sovereignty and territorial integrity in the case of Ukraine, absolutely crucial. So I join with other speakers in focusing on the importance of respect and implementation of international norms. Kia ora.